I just wanted to say hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to our virtual program. Any step back into the old ways is naturally a hindrance, Fort Lewis Indian School, 1892 to 1911, presented by Dr. Majel Boxer, Associate Professor of Native American and Indigenous Studies here at Fort Lewis College. Before we get started, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that the land that Fort Lewis College is situated upon is the ancestral land and territory of the Sioux people who were forcibly removed from by the United States government. Also that this land is connected to the communal and ceremonial spaces of the Jicarilla Apache, Pueblos of New Mexico, Hopi Sinam, and the Diné Nations. It's really important that we take a moment, especially considering the topic that we're talking about, to acknowledge this setting, for at least for Majel and I are here in Durango, because these narratives, the narrative of these lands have been long told just from one dominant perspective and without full recognition of the original land stewards who continue to inhabit and connect with this land. So thank you all for taking a moment and giving attention and respect to acknowledging that important legacy. Now I'm going to turn you over to Dr. Boxer and let her do a full introduction of herself and share her expertise with us on Fort Lewis Indian School. You'll see there is a chat function. We'll do some question and answer at the end. So if you want to drop any questions as we go along into the chat, feel free to do that. So with that, Majel.
Thank you for that introduction, Liz. I'll go ahead and I would like to take this moment also to introduce myself in the Dakota language. Dakota Chajepikin Washtena Wing, Washichu Chajepikin Dr. Majel Boxer, Wakchicha Wakpa Ed Watie, Damakota, Sisseton Na Wahpeton Wakchicha Wakpa Oma Wapiwe, Ate Waye Tony Boxer, Ichiapi, Ina Waye Julia Ramirez Boxer, Ichiapie, Tony Boxer Sr., Tunkashida Ichiapi, Maddie Ina Ricker Boxer Unchi Ichiapie. I introduce myself by giving you my Dakota name, my English name. I am from the place of the Poplar Rivers, that is the Fort Peck, Assiniboine and Sioux Reservation. And then I also shared with you my parents' name and also my paternal grandparents, both who are deceased. This afternoon, I want to share with you my talk titled, Any Step Back into the Old Ways is Naturally a Hindrance, Fort Lewis Indian School, 1892 through 1911. And as Liz introduced, I am an associate professor of Native American and Indigenous Studies here at Fort Lewis College, located in Durango, Colorado. I also, like Liz mentioned, would like to give a land acknowledgement. And I also want to share with you an important part of that land acknowledgement, which is an understanding and a recognition of the creation stories of the Nuchu, Diné, Hopi Sinam, and Apache peoples. That in all of these stories, the Creator placed the ancestors on these very lands. And so it's important for me to recognize these creation stories for the Ute peoples, the Nuchu, whose creation placed them among their sacred mountains, including Sleeping Ute Mountain, located near present-day Cortez, Colorado. I also want to acknowledge the Diné peoples whose emergence centered them amongst the sacred mountains, including the Sa, located in the north, and this is also known as Mount Hesperus. The Pueblo people, the Hopi and the Hopi people, whose ancestors' homelands encompassed much of present-day Southwest Colorado. And finally, the Apache peoples, whose ancestral men and ancestral women were the first to climb up into the upper world. And today we are living in this upper world. So I wanted to begin with that acknowledgement and to really center my research knowing and understanding that the students who attended Fort Lewis Indian School came from these tribal homelands and many more, but that Durango and Hesperus and even Breen, location of Fort Lewis, those locations are the homelands of diverse peoples. As I begin my talk, I want to share with you one of the guiding concepts that guides my work and my inquiry into Fort Lewis Indian School history. I'm guided by this concept of the absent presence, and I cite the work of Professor Myla Vicente Carpio. And in her work, she explains the absent presence. She states, Indigenous history is the absent presence in American history, deliberately erased or radically transformed to maintain the master narrative. The processes of colonization have created this absence in the American historical memory, which shapes how Indigenous history, space, or place have been defined and continue to be renamed, redefined, and destroyed. Briefly, my efforts are really about uncovering the voices and the history of Fort Lewis Indian School students, but I also want to connect it to present day. And the sign that you see here, and I'll go back to the larger slide, the sign that you see here, Fort Lewis College, founded 1911. This sign you see as you travel up the front hill onto campus. And on the days I use the front hill route, 1911 tells me a lot of things. It tells me about whose history is included and recognized, but it also, more importantly, tells me whose history is excluded. So 1911 was the year that Fort Lewis opened up as a high school. We weren't even a college at that point. It remained a high school through 1933, and then turned into a high school and a two-year college from 1927 to 1933. And then Agriculture and Mechanics College, which was a two-year college, all the way through 1957, when campus opened in its present location, still a two-year college. So it's a powerful reminder, 1911, of when the school admitted non-Native students, and that non-Native history is recognized in that founding date. So that's how the absent presence works for me, that it is that powerful reminder, again, of what history is included, but who is excluded from that history. To begin with, I want to situate and give you a context to federal Indian boarding schools. That Fort Lewis Indian School belonged to this era, which was a federal policy of assimilation between the years 1880s through the 1920s. Reformers at this time, their goal was to assimilate Indigenous peoples into the dominant American society. That assimilation was to be accomplished for them in two primary ways. So the first, and that's the focus of the talk, is through the removal of children to boarding schools, to make boarding school attendance compulsory, mandatory, and then also simultaneously through the passage of the Allotment Act. And that the allotment of the reservation was so that heads of household, single men and women, and orphans would each receive an allotment, and that they would learn how to treat that allotment as real estate, as property. And so the attempt of these reformers were to transform the lives of Native people in the image of the dominant society. Nowhere in this were Native people consulted or asked about their own ideas of what would best benefit them or how they would improve their own lives. So again, assimilation is the policy, and the goal of the time really was to remove children, to start with young children, and to get them to learn the ways of the dominant society. I'm going to provide just some overview and some statistics of Indian boarding schools, which includes Fort Lewis. Just as a quick glance, this era, again, of assimilation included nearly 24 federally run off-reservation boarding schools. At the turn of the century, Fort Lewis was operating, and you'll notice that it's located as having opened its doors in 1892. One of the more well-known boarding schools at this time was Carlisle Indian Industrial School. That was the first school to open in 1879. And you see it there on the left side. Geographically, here's where these schools were located. This map here shows both on reservation or non-reservation schools in the blue dot, and then reservation schools, on reservation schools in the black dot. If you can see the difference between the two. Carlisle is always the one noted for being the first institution to open its doors, the first and purposely, located on the East Coast. And then you see a smattering in the Northern Plains region. And then we're here in the lower Four Corners of Fort Lewis. There also was a school in Grand Junction. So that's geographically. I should mention, and I might mention it maybe another time in the talk, but the real intent of off-reservation boarding schools was that the school was purposely located at a distance, that the hope was that children would attend school, but that they would never return, that their summer months would be spent in a program called the outing program. And it simply was kind of like a work release program where students were paired up with willing families, these were non-native families, and that they were supposed to take the skills learned during the school year and then have them actually see how they work within a family context, or working on a farm, or being paired up maybe with a family in town. And there are examples of several students who were partnered up with families in the town of Durango. By the numbers, I will say that the records for Indian school attendance had been spotty at best in the early years of federally run or mission run schools. But as the boarding school movement grew in scope and in size, better records were taken. And so we can see how in 1877, 3,500, just over 3,500 Native students were in attendance at some type of school, whether that was a day school or one that was run by a federal or mission run school. And then we can see by the 1900, over 21,000 students were attending some type of educational institution. And again, purpose was to assimilate Native children and to separate them from their families. I'd like to provide an overview of Fort Lewis Indian School, and then I'll focus on the particulars. So I organized my talk around 5 themes. The themes that I want to share with you are school life, the well-being of students, the denigration of spiritual and cultural practices, guardianship and paternalism, and parent and child relationships. My primary documents come from the years 1904 and 1905. And at this time, this Fort Lewis Indian School was under the superintendency of William W. Peterson. At all times in my research, I wanted to include the names of students. So when possible, so that their presence isn't erased. And again, to give voice to the voiceless and to find them within the historical and archival record in these unexpected places. What you see before you then is just a brief overview of Fort Lewis Indian School. And I can say that the record keeping wasn't always the best and it wasn't always consistent. That there were years in which tribal affiliations were noted, and then years where they were just simply numbers or separated by gender. So just understand that the record is incomplete and never consistent. In the early years of Fort Lewis Indian School, there was a United States Indian inspector by the name of C.C. Duncan, and he sent a letter to the Secretary of the Interior, and he wrote about his observations of Fort Lewis Indian School. He said, "This school organized March 1892 has not to present time been a success. But the school has been small and now contains only 128 pupils, and 41 of these have been transferred from the Santa Fe School, and if returned upon the opening of that school, will leave the Fort Lewis School with but 87 pupils. It seems to me that this school could be supplied with scholars from the Southern Utes, and I think there are at least 150 children of that tribe of school age, a large proportion of whom could be brought into that school. And I would recommend that the agent be authorized to use some compulsion to compel the attendance of children of this tribe." He goes on to write that most of the children in attendance, being as the order named from the Mescalero Apaches, Jicarilla Apaches, White Mountain Apaches, San Carlos Apaches, Papagos, Pimas, Diggers, Navajos, and Utes, there being no school on the reservation, it occurs to me that the rule of preventing the removal of Indian children from the reservation should be relaxed, and these children be given the benefit of an education by being forced into the Fort Lewis School. This letter, written by the Indian inspector Duncan, was written in 1892, again, the year that Fort Lewis opened its doors. But I just wanted to make brief mention of some of his language in this letter. He definitely separates out the various communities of Apache people that are represented in the student body. And then he also goes on to use the word diggers. And so this word, I just wanted to make you know that it's in reference to the common language of the time, but that it was derogatory, and it referenced California Native people who used a digging stick to gather their traditional foods. And yet that digging stick and their method of collecting food became the way that they were known, and that it increasingly became a derogatory term. So I just wanted you to be aware that the language often in these letters reflects the time and are very indicative of that era. All the while, Fort Lewis Indian School, under the various superintendents, really worked to try and secure Ute children for school. And the Ute people, especially under their leadership of chiefs like Ignacio and Severo, really opposed sending their children to Fort Lewis Indian School. And they would have good reason to do so, because in some of these years that are represented before you are also several children who died while at school. And so Chiefs Ignacio and Severo knew of this, and they refused to allow their children to attend Fort Lewis School anymore. In fact, the Ute chiefs preferred that their children be sent to what would be the Ignacio Day School. But in the early years of Fort Lewis Indian School, that was not the option. But again, there was resistance against sending children to school. Fort Lewis Indian School had a school day that was highly regimented, and a curriculum that was meant to instill patriotism into the students, and so that children would start to see themselves as Americans. So the school day was highly regimented, and there was a reason behind that. Captain Richard Henry Pratt, who was the original architect behind Indian boarding schools and the founder of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, he himself was a former military man, and he oversaw a group of Cheyenne and Kiowa prisoners taken into prison in Florida at St. Augustine. Pratt learned from that moment that military life, which was highly regimented, would be a way to have and exert power over the prisoners, but also he hoped would instill in them the ideal of being industrious and to want to change and to become more and more acculturated to the dominant society. So the school day was regimented. For example, let me go back. For example, I'll just pause here for a moment, where the superintendent, writing in 1905, he wanted to have the matron of the little boys have very specific roll calls. And so he writes to her that the boys needed to have a roll call in this way. So he describes 6:25 a.m. an all boys roll call, 7:20 a work detail roll call, 8:20 school detail, 11:55 all boys, 12:50 p.m. school detail, 1:10 p.m. school detail, 5:25 an all boys detail, a roll call rather. Superintendent Peterson writes that roll call for each company before bedtime and inspection of beds after all have been retired. Any unexcused or unaccounted for absence will be at once reported to the industrial teacher. So again, that highly regimented day, very militaristic, corporal punishment definitely was part of that experience for children. And constant checking in on where the students were. Where were the boys at? Are they failing to show up for their work detail? You know, did they make it to their class? And you can see from that brief explanation too, that they were getting quite a mix of like school curriculum teaching, but also work detail. And so the school itself was very much focused on that industrial training and the hope that children would learn some of these skilled trades as part of that assimilation process. Let me go back to this. So the school curriculum then included speaking, reading, and writing in English, of course. Estelle Reel, who served as the superintendent of Indian schools, wrote in 1905 to Superintendent Peterson. She writes that in regards to teaching the Indian children to speak English, and I assure you, you will have my cooperation of the school. As you say, there is no other way to teach the children than by the object. Estelle Reel was really known for wanting students to learn and speak English, but also really promoting the vocational training part of the school day. I also want to add into that too, is that other scholars have noted that because of the focus of English and English only, it came at the detriment of educators and the dominant society seeing Indian children as stoic and not even talkative. And that stereotype of, you know, the quiet native student, the stoic child, those stereotypes still pervade in education. And scholars like Loma Waima and McCarthy write that, you know, in a real way, children were robbed of their voice because they were forbidden from learning and speaking in their own native language. But they were robbed of that voice, and what they had left then was only the English language. Part of the curriculum included the singing and playing of national airs, and Peterson himself requested of a businessman that the school be provided with band sheet music as above, and he gives a list of instruments that the students would be playing. But the songs included the Star Spangled Banner, America, the Red, White, and Blue, Dixie, and Hail Columbia. So again, in teaching patriotism in the school, that was done through such things as music and rewarding students who did well in singing or had special talents, in playing the instruments. I just want to make a side comment here on this image of this photograph where Fort Lewis Indian School was well known for its marching band. And there are several instances where there were some fairs, like regional fairs or county fairs, even in Farmington, where the presence of Fort Lewis Indian School was requested. And so Superintendent Peterson accepted the letters and promised, that the students would show or, would try and participate in the county fairs. And there was one even in Durango. I want to end here on the curriculum by focusing on farming and gardening alongside the schoolwork. So Peterson, Estelle Real would write to Peterson that every effort is being made to have the farm idea permeate the schoolroom work to as great an extent as possible. She continues in her letter, school gardens will be made by all the primary pupils under the direction of the primary teacher, and the girls will have their individual plats under the charge of the girls' matron. Attention will be given to the proper instruction concerning the plants, their growth, and an earnest effort will be made to have each garden produce results. One of the interesting things about the records that Fort Lewis Indian School kept, records compiled by the superintendent, were just the types of records that they were interested in keeping. So even though attendance and tribal affiliation was haphazardly done, the school was very much documenting how many bushels of garden crops that the school was producing, whether it was wheat, whether it was beans or corn. Those records were very lengthy, and it shows the emphasis and the focus, on what the school was producing. How was it being self-sufficient and using student labor to have that self-sufficiency. This brings me to the first theme that I really wanted to explore, and that's the theme of well-being. I first want to begin by talking about illnesses. Fort Lewis, there were many moments where illnesses spread amongst the students, illnesses that even led to student deaths, which is why later on in the school history, Chiefs Ignacio and Severo prohibited or forbade their children from attending Fort Lewis. In 1905, Peterson wrote a letter writing that Shay, Lillaby, and a little girl from the 2 Gray Hills have had pneumonia. Shay is well, and I think the other girl will be soon. Annie Antonio is a little sick, but not much. She will sit up tomorrow. He also made a note that a young boy, a very small, thin boy, was brought into school last fall by a man who gave his name as Naki Denanes and who said his home was in the village above your place. A letter written to a man in Crozer, New Mexico. Superintendent said, the boy is not at all well. He is not sick in bed. He is very listless and he can't be roused up to anything. If they want to take him home, I shall be glad to have them do so. There's these moments when superintendent is writing letters where it's never just, black or white, that children were not cared for or that children were. Peterson does express the desire that sick children be returned to their families, like he did in this letter. But it also goes back to the bigger point of well-being and what it means to thrive in school. And in this letter, Peterson describes this young boy as being listless, being very listless, that he can't be roused up to anything. So, listlessness, failing to thrive in the school environment really is a sign that well-being wasn't fully achieved, that students might have had adequate food, they might have had a roof over their heads. Some of the dormitories were not adequate, but that isn't enough to say that the students thrived or that the students were doing well. Well-being includes an abundance of happiness and of being healthy and thriving. And we just don't see it in some of these letters that the students experience that. So I just wanted to broaden up that idea of what true well-being entails. There was always a constant issue of the dormitories being inadequate. In many of the letters in the budget requests written by the superintendent, he always requested that a new building, a new dormitory for the boys, must be approved, that they were living in a very drafty former hospital of the Army post, and that, that the boys needed better housing. They were always close and crowded into these dormitories. And so that contributed to the spread of things such as lice and, of course, diseases of the eye, things like trachoma. I want to share with you a letter from William Peterson to the assistant matron, Elizabeth Powell. And he writes to her, "My attention was called this afternoon to the condition in which the girls' heads were found." He continues, "You will at once see personally that the small girls' heads are made clean and that they are kept so. And since the heads of the girls with short hair were found to be in the worst condition, it is evident that hair cutting is not a remedy, and for that reason, no more girls will have their hair cut, cut." He finishes that saying that weekly inspections and fine combs can be requisitioned. I find it interesting too that Peterson was very focused on the spread of lice, but also noted that short hair wasn't the way to keep lice from spreading. It wasn't done out of the concern or the desires of families to keep their children's hair long, which is culturally appropriate, but rather, again, that short hair wasn't a deterrent in keeping lice from spreading. And again, that goes back to the living conditions, and it should not be taken as an indication of how children were amongst themselves, in the sense like, they weren't dirty, they weren't filthy, but they were doing the best they can with inadequate living conditions. My next thing I wanted to touch on was the denigration of spiritual and cultural practices. Here, Peterson makes a note of a young girl who is sick, and he said that regarding the health of Laura Pete, daughter of Sosin Vega, the ex-policeman, I desire to say that she has gone down very rapidly since I talked with you. And he's writing to the superintendent at Shiprock. Peterson continues, "It seems impossible to find out what is the matter with her. In some respects, her trouble resembles tuberculosis, and in other respects, not at all. Our physician, who has given her every attention, is unable to decide." He closes his letter with this: "There is no doubt, however, but that her trouble was aggravated by their singing over her last summer, as she has never been really well since the return to the fort." Again, interesting that a young girl and her family, I would say, Danae, who are looking to traditional healing practices as a way to help their daughter, that for Peterson, he really denigrates that. He said that the real trouble is not the pneumonia, but last summer, when her family was singing over her, and that she hasn't been well ever since. He does that a few times too. Another example of him denigrating spiritual practices, it's unrelated to Fort Lewis Indian School, but Peterson also oversaw the allotted Ute people along the Animas and La Plata rivers. And so an issue was brought to his attention about the presence of a ceremonial pipe found in, quote, an Aztec ruin. Peterson said, the Utes do not use pipes at all now, and if they did once use them, it would not be likely that one would be buried in an Aztec ruin, as the living Indians avoid those places as much as possible. Again, Peterson, seems to suggest that Ute people were superstitious or that they have nothing to do with ceremonial pipes. But the reality of this is that, again, this letter was in 1904, but even within 10 years before this, the Indian Crimes Code was passed by law in the United States Senate or Congress, and the Indian Religious Crime Code forbade any Native person from practicing their spiritual practices, from possessing sacred and ceremonial objects. So for Native people, it meant that you practice those things privately, under the cover of darkness, perhaps away from agents, superintendents, or folks like William Peterson. So for him, he says that Ute people would have nothing to do with a ceremonial pipe. But another way to understand that is that he doesn't know the people at all, and he doesn't know because he's simply not privy to that part of their lives. So spiritual and cultural practices were denigrated, at least in some respects, in Peterson's attitude towards them, and him completely misunderstanding why Native people like the Ute peoples would stay away from a place that's called, quote, an Aztec ruin. He doesn't understand the sacred nature of these places, and that there are teachings that go along with why one avoids those places, and those continue even to this day. And again, it's largely unnoticed by Peterson. I'll talk briefly on the theme of guardianship and paternalism. So guardianship and paternalism definitely belong in this era of assimilation. Part of this guardianship and paternalism arrives from the policy promoted by United States policies, is just that Native people were viewed as domestic dependent nations was the legal definition, that the trust relationship and the trust doctrine arrived that to the point where the United States oversaw the interests of Native people and their lands. We also see that in how Peterson conducted himself and oversaw matters going on at Fort Lewis Indian School, but also amongst the allotted Utes of the La Plata and Animas rivers. Briefly, I just want to share with you an example of that language that Peterson employs that really tell us how he views himself as the guardian, and that children or Ute people are his wards, and it's his responsibility, to look out for his wards. In 1905, Peterson would write to the Indian agent at Pine Ridge. He, speaking of William Spear, who's a Navajo boy, will be carried as an outing pupil belonging to the school. He is an excellent boy, industrious and trustworthy, and he will, I hope, make a good citizen Indian someday. Again, the language of belonging to this school, he said. Peterson also says, of course, that it is contrary to the regulations of the Indian office to allow pupils of a non-reservation school to return to their homes before the end of the terms for which they have entered. From the school standpoint, it is not a good thing for them to go home at all, to say nothing of their getting so dirty and full of parasites that it has as much work to clean them, it is as much work to clean them up as it is when they first came. I cannot say that our civilization is positively better than theirs in every respect, but it is the kind that is being put upon them more or less by force of necessity, and any step back into the old ways is naturally a hindrance. If I pause for a moment, again, he takes guardianship of Indian pupils very seriously, and the language he uses as belonging to the school. Another letter, I have been appointed her guardian by the courts of the state, and she will have to remain under my legal charge until she is 18 years of age. This was a young student named Herminia, and again, that language of, she's a ward and he's the guardian, and he'll oversee her. Peterson goes a step further because he also has superintendency over the allotted utes along the Animas. So there are times when he is very much protective, if you will, of Ute lands. Let me get to an example here. He writes, to all cattle and sheep owners, you will take notice that all persons found trespassing on Ute allotments or on the Ute reservation will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law in the federal courts. And so on the one hand, he's protective of Ute lands. That's that paternalism stepping in, and also the trust doctrine, which dictates that Indian agents must operate in the best interest of their wards. Peterson also said that anything you can do towards the apprehension and conviction of anyone selling liquor to the Indians will have my fullest support. He also, takes it a step further, and he, again, in regards to non-Native people, that anyone selling liquor to Native people will have the fullest support of being prosecuted or convicted of that. So that guardianship runs deep, and he took his role as superintendent of the school and also of allotted youths very seriously. I want to focus on policing and runaways. So there were many mentions of students who ran away from Fort Lewis Indian School, and that for sure did happen. I also want to say that it was maybe a tactic used by superintendent to hire Native men to police their own community, or for Native men to go after the runaways. I'll give an example. He writes about the Indian Sandoval in 1904, and he says, I desire to say that I have had perhaps more to do with him than any other of the Navajos, and that my dealings with him have been satisfactory. He has kept his word with me as far as has been possible for him to do, and he has given me more help in gathering children than has any other Indian. The motivations for Native men to accept deployment as an Indian police, that their motivations were diverse, but also that they were in many ways compelled to take that position. Here, Peterson said that he recommends a man named Akowitz, and that Akowitz be made a policeman at the increase of $5 per month in wages. But I am not going to continue him in that position or in any other unless he makes up his mind to put his boy in school and to use his influence to help the school all he can. So again, a very strategic move, but a move by Peterson to employ Native men who knew the surrounding country, knew their communities, but also compelling men to make that difficult decision to earn a wage. But also, for Akowitz, he couldn't get that extra $5 a month unless he made up his mind to put his boy in school. So countless times, again, the motivations of parents are complex. They're not easily understood, or can we easily reduce it down to, something that we would say, well, I wouldn't do that. I just wouldn't accept the position, because we don't know the motivations, but they were had some very compelling reasons why one would accept that position of policeman. There are examples, as I mentioned, of students running away, and I just want to mention one of them. Again, Peterson, writing in 1905, he states, Bill Gunn, an allotted Ute boy who has been in school here, ran away yesterday. If you find him there, he's writing to the superintendent in Ignacio now. If you find him there and will send him over with a policeman, I shall be glad to pay the police for bringing the boy. So runaways, again, are important to understand, just as these moments and acts of resistance that students who may have not had any autonomy in attending school or attended for various reasons, that they did run away, and that they ran away knowing that they may have to return to school or be caught and returned to school. All right, so I'm being mindful of time. So I want to just focus finally on the parent and child relationship. Letter writing was a primary way that students were able to share with their parents about their lives while at school. That the superintendent often made efforts to encourage children to write to their parents. He also was really in many letters, quick to facilitate that parent-child relationship. So he writes about to a Fulgencio Lucero from Tierra Amarilla, New Mexico. Peterson tells the father that he will say Leonardo very well, and that I do not know of any reason why he has not written you, except that he has neglected it. I will see him and ask him to write at once. The pupils can write once every month or oftener if they desire to do so. So when possible, Peterson did try to encourage parent and child relationships. And I also want to say that parents, many of them did want their children to attend Fort Lewis School, that they would write to Peterson asking if their child could be sent, and that Peterson would accept those students into the school. He writes in 1905, Jim Weaselskin has been here to see me with reference to putting his boy in Fort Lewis School. So I think it's important for us to understand that Indian school attendance in many instances was compulsory, but within that there's a diversity of parental responses that parents, some of them hid away or left camp quietly so that they wouldn't have to send their child to school. But then there are also parents who did send their child to school or sought out Peterson in requesting that their child be enrolled in school. The final thing I wanted to mention on parent and child relationships is just that, again, Peterson did not understand the complex family structure that Native families have. He seemed to be quite confused by how many fathers a young boy named Carl Aloysius had. And he writes that it's the hardest thing in the world to get the right fathers for these children. So I don't know, if he was purely exasperated and just didn't know who the father was, but he also didn't understand the family structure, that children had, of course, mother and father, but their aunts and uncles served also as the surrogate mother and fathers. And if I could share with you that in my Dakota language, mother Ina, her sister, your aunt, actually is the same word, Ina. So you called your mother and her sisters your mother, and that word is used for what would otherwise be an aunt. So that exists within family life, and Peterson seemed to not understand that, and his frustration was evident in that letter. In closing, my focus was again on finding and giving voice to the Native students who attended Fort Lewis Indian School, and that Fort Lewis Indian School ended or ceased operating in 1910. In that year, the Federal Indian Appropriation Bill contained this language that said lands and buildings shall be held and maintained by the state of Colorado as an institute of learning, and that Indian pupils shall at all times be admitted to such school free of charge for tuition and on terms of equality with white pupils. That tuition waiver, it's a bit of a misnomer. However, that continues today. For eligible Native students who apply for the tuition waiver, their tuition is covered. In 1971, the state of Colorado made an attempt to curtail and diminish the waiver and only extend it to resident, or today we would use the language of in-state students. A lawsuit filed by two Native students who were attending the college at the time and who would have been classified as non-resident or out-of-state students filed a lawsuit in district court in Denver. And the district court found that the state had failed to honor this 1910 agreement. The state of Colorado appealed the case, and the case went to the 10th District Court of Appeals, but the 10th District Court of Appeals reaffirmed the lower court's ruling and stated that there is a contractual agreement between the state and Native American students. This still exists, and it's another area that our institution is working to provide information and context to the tuition waiver so that we could better teach those around us, especially non-Native students and faculty, about the origins of the tuition waiver, the language that's contained within it, and also the fact that we are a Native serving institution. And so to that end, our institution is doing much to reconcile the Indian school history with our with who we are today. You know, how can we be better at being an institution that welcomes and really finds ways to make our students succeed. So with that, I will go ahead and, as time allows, ask if there are any questions. So I know Liz said that there might be potential questions that could be posted in the Q&A, but also if you have any questions that you just want to follow up with me, my email is boxer_m@fortlewis.edu.
Thank you so much, Majel. That was really informative, and I really appreciated kind of reading between the lines of all those historical documents. That's a specialized practice, so we appreciate that. And I do see we have one question in the Q&A, and I'll ask it to you out loud here. But folks can drop stuff into the chat or the Q&A. And we'll try to answer them, or talk to Majel. She's full of information. So the question is, in your research, have you found any reference of the students working in or even planting the orchard? We think the orchard at the old fort was planted after the boarding school was closed, but we're not certain. Thank you for your research and for teaching this important history. And that's from the orchard restoration folks. So.
I haven't come across anything yet that's specific to mention of an orchard at the Indian school site. It's something that I will put on my radar as I continue to do my research. I do want to mention that, the concept that I started with, the absent presence. I teach for our program, NAIS, I'm teaching this semester our history of Indian or Native American education and current trends. And in that class, we had a field trip out to the Indian school site, which is more commonly referred to as the old fort site. A lot of the original buildings are gone. And so really the absent presence is that feeling of knowing about the Indian school, Native children who were in attendance, but really not having any physical evidence of that even today. There's a small handful of original buildings, but largely that presence is erased, through time, and what happened after Fort Lewis had closed its doors as an Indian school.
Anybody else with questions? I have another one here from Claire. It says, thank you for this important talk. I wondered if there are any letters by the students themselves.
So the simple answer is no. But that's not to say I have exhausted all avenues of research yet. Primarily the documents that the Center of Southwest Studies houses and what's at the National Archives are the letters from the superintendent. So I'm really, again, the absent presence is such too that the records of Fort Lewis Indian School are not complete. They're not fully, fully documented the entire years of operation. Student letters, student work are not in the archives. But again, that's not to say that the search has been done and exhausted. So I'm still in that research process of looking at other places, other locations to see where those, see if there are student letters or, if you will, evidence of the student work.
And then I have another one from Rachel. Is this history taught to the current student body in any formal way?
I think right now we are, as an institution, working on offering an online class, or I don't like the word training module, but like an instructional unit for incoming students to learn about Fort Lewis Indian School history. We are just really at the beginning stage of reconciling Fort Lewis Indian School history to today's student and who we are as an institution today. A few weeks ago on Labor Day, we took that first step, I think, with, and there were several leading steps up to that point, but under the leadership and guidance of Dr. Lee Bidsoy, who is our Associate Vice President for Diversity and the Special Advisor to the President on Indigenous Affairs, led our entire campus through the process of removing these clock tower panels that depicted Indian school history in a very overly simplified way, in a way that almost glorified the assimilation process and kind of in celebratory ways. So as an institution, we just removed those clock tower panels. They, I believe, were taken to the Center of Southwest Studies, and so Liz could probably talk a little bit on that point. But that's just the first step. And so the follow-up steps would be to have, again, a class that students can take and learn the history. For NEIS in my program, of course, our students know Indian school history very well, and they get that history through our class that I'm currently teaching. But I agree, it definitely needs to be institutionalized and made available. Myself, alongside Dr. Bitsoy, we led the faculty in a faculty fall retreat where we covered this very same talk and had moments where we could talk as faculty of how do we make the classroom inclusive? How do we not contribute to that, denigration or lack of understanding about the spiritual and ceremonial needs of our students? So as faculty, we had a very lively discussion and I think excitement over where we go from this. And this is just the starting point.
Yeah, Majel and I have done some committee work together, and I think there is a lot of commitment across campus to not only address the obvious stuff, but that erasure, that stuff that's between the lines, and really make everybody aware of Fort Lewis's history. So yeah, it's good. I have, how many Indian boarding schools were in Colorado?
There was an Indian boarding school in Grand Junction, which was the off-reservation or non-reservation boarding school. And then there were day schools located in Toyac. and then also in Ignacio. So those 4 schools, at least on the western slope, were meant to take in primarily Ute children, but alongside neighboring Native nations, so it's why Fort Lewis was uniquely positioned to take in students who were Hopi students, Pueblo students, Dene, and then the various communities of Apache peoples. So there was quite a diverse number of students from all types of tribal affiliations attending Fort Lewis. And like I said, always the goal was to get Ute children into the school. And then the Southern Utes were very much opposed to that, having experienced the loss of their children through death when they did send their children to school. So there's kind of that contradiction. In my class, we talked about this where, while children were sent to Ignacio Day School, yes, it still was a boarding school, but given difficult decisions of, sending them further away to Fort Lewis, Chief Ignacio would at least prefer that the children be kept close to home, and they were sent to the day school in Ignacio, even if that still was a boarding school, and that the curriculum still was that Americanized curriculum. So the difficult decision was, do you keep your kids close, knowing full well what that entails, or do you send them far away where they're far away and you don't have ready access to your children?
And the jump around. Kathleen asks, does Durango have a Native American commission for the city?
Durango have a Native American commission. If I'm understanding the question, are you asking if there's like a city of Durango, like Native American commission? To my knowledge, I haven't come across anything on the city side. Durango City, having a standing committee or a select committee really devoted to Native American issues. Again, I can be corrected if somebody knows more of what's going on downtown than up here on the Mesa.
I do think there are groups working. I don't know if they're specifically Native focused, and I don't know how formal all of that is. So yeah, I feel like I know people who can answer this question better than me, but they're not here.
I know that there's informally a Native people, it's an informal group, but Native people who live in Durango and who come together on issues that are close to home. So the Toateen sign controversy that happened, was it over the summer? And it's cyclical. The sign always gets attention from residents and also folks outside of Durango. I know a number of Native people who live in town are very much involved and working to better educate the non-Native residents of Durango about how that sign is stereotypical and denigrates Native people.
Okay, Mary says, thank you for your excellent insights. Are there ways that the presence of the students, the Fort Lewis Indian School, those who took to honor those students who attended Fort Lewis Indian School, and are there issues or unfinished business that need to be resolved?
I think we're just in that stage right now, part of that healing and reconciliation just began prior to the pandemic. As Liz mentioned, the college president gave a directive to the dean of arts and sciences to establish a Fort Lewis history committee. So that committee had met and had town halls about what to do with the clock tower panels. The pandemic hit us as it hit everyone, and that put a halt to our planning. So we picked up again with the removal of the clock tower panels. And so we're really just in the infancy of what we can do and how we can promote healing and honoring of Native students who attended Fort Lewis Indian School, and also how we can represent this history. And I know it's a project that the Center of Southwest Studies is very much interested in. And even years ago, back in 2011, when the college had a centennial celebration of its founding, which we know wasn't really in 1911, we can go back further, but how there was an entire exhibit about Fort Lewis from its military post days through Indian school, through high school, junior college, up until four-year college. So we've had moments where we've looked at the history and really, stared at it and understood what the history means, but we're coming back to it again. And that could be in the curriculum, training for faculty and staff, finding public ways to honor and memorialize the students. So we're only just touching the tip of the iceberg here. I like.
Yeah, we're at the center. I know we're in the early stages of working on an exhibit. We have Elise Bollinger, who was the student curator on our last exhibit or our current exhibit Throughline, and she's going to work with the campus community and students again and be maybe more specific about the boarding school. So there'll be more information coming out about that work. That's like just a tiny baby idea right now. But yeah, Majel, I think, yeah, we're all working in a lot of directions, I think, and really in the early stages. So Kathy Gibson says the photographs are what we can use to understand, document the past. Some were taken by my great-grandfather. As you know, it is important to preserve our heritage. And it's not really a question, but I do think it's interesting. And I guess I'm going to add my question onto that, which is, have you used the photos to do any of that reading, like between the lines, or any of your historical research?
I would say I haven't done that. I think I need to get more connected again with Nick Kandorsky, the archivist from the Center Southwest Studies, because I don't want to, I need to start with what information we do know and that the center has collected, but also to examine the photographs as well. And I just pulled just a small handful of the record of the photos that are available. And here's one too of the Fort Lewis Indian School. Another picture of them in the background there.
And then I have another question from Landry. It says, will there be another day of dialogue for the fall semester? So I think that's referring to some of our talking sessions that we held in the past.
I would hope so. I think that we need to come back or circle back to some of the ideas that were expressed in the initial town halls. Again, this was a year and a half ago before the pandemic. Some of the takeaways from that, I know the provost is working on today. So to that end, and like the results of those talking town halls were that there is the intent to have an Indigenous garden on campus, and that there are a number of folks interested in bringing closer to campus and having on campus this Indigenous garden, where in 1 year one might grow blue corn and then have all types of curriculum tie-ins from all across campus. The cultural teachings, that NAIS would definitely be connected and plugged into, but also like the more of the biology and environment background and teachings of that as well. So I know we're just, again, in the infancy, but I know the provost is very much interested in pursuing and having that Indigenous plants and a garden on campus. To that end, also, since our dialogues, we, as far as NAIS, Native American Indigenous Studies, our provost has received a Mellon grant. And the Mellon grant is meant to build up our NEIS program with the hiring of 4 more faculty so that we could, as a program that's devoted to the defense of sovereignty and indigenousness, that would just add to our current 3 faculty members. And we really do offer that curriculum that's grounded in indigenous ways of knowing that has been or had been denied to Indian school students across the board. So NEIS really is, we as a discipline came out in the 1960s advocating for inclusive curriculum, and so here we are 50 years later, and at Fort Lewis having an opportunity to grow our program as well. So I hope those dialogues continue. A lot of very concrete things came out of that we'll see on campus. And so I'm looking forward to seeing those come into fruition.
This is more of a comment than a question, but it's an interesting comment, so I'm going to throw it out. It says, Connie says, when you find student letters, I'd be interested in knowing if their letters home were censored by the school. And then it says, thank you for your talk. It's very important to continue to get out this history, not only to FLC faculty and students, but also for the Durango community. So yeah, I think people are really interested in learning about this stuff. So we really appreciate you talking about it. Another question, has or will Fort Lewis be scanned with Lidar? I think talking about some of the work related to looking for students potentially who passed away and are buried on.
What was that last part of the question?
Lidar, it's a technique for scanning the landscape.
I know that what's going on nationally and internationally in Canada has been the discovery, the uncovering of Native student graves and cemeteries that have been at boarding schools. In Canada, they really are doing that difficult work now and finding, the last count has been over 5,000 student graves located across Canada that were unknown to Canadian officials. But I know in like the social media circles that I travel in, that for First Nations people, they said, we knew our children were buried. Now that time of reconciliation and healing is coming full circle, where they're going to, return the children to their respective communities. So the oral history, and families know their family history stories too of children who did not return from school, and it's only the dominant society catching up. So Fort Lewis, I think that too is another area that needs to be explored, is to, in conjunction with our Ute Mountain Ute, Southern Ute, Dene, Hickory, Apache, Hopi, all of the communities to really have that conversation and to see what their desires are as sovereign nations, and how Fort Lewis as an institution can help further that healing process. But we, again, are just, we're just coming to this reconciliation of even knowing the history, and for many in the first time in a real way, to now, where do we go from here? How do we move forward as an institution?
I have a question. What can well-meaning white allies and friends of Native and Indigenous people who want to support the reconciliation process as it unfolds be doing in this moment to most leverage privilege?
That's a great question. I think there first has to be a space for Native people to have and start the conversation, and to have like this healing space where Native people or the tribal communities can come together unto themselves to say, here's what would help us, and to articulate that to allies, and then for allies to recognize that you don't want to crowd the space that's created with your own points and your own, lack of better agenda, but that you really are listening. And I think that's the best way to start, is to listen and to hear, and to allow time and space for Native people who are directly impacted by Fort Lewis Indian School to have that conversation themselves, and then for them to decide, like, here's what we want, and here's what's going to happen, and then step in, and use the talents and the funds to do that hard work.
And then one more question, and then there's a few nice comments, which I think you can also check out in the chat. But this question is, I wonder if any interviews could be done with Native Americans who heard stories handed down in their families about the schools.
Mm-hmm. In my history of Native American education class, we were talking about this very thing. Some of my students quite rightly say that their grandparents don't talk about this, and that they've never heard these stories because of that purposeful silence. So on the one hand, not everyone has shared their Indian school experience with their children, or even with grandchildren. But for those that do want to share, I think that in all of my classes, I teach oral history and oral history methods. I give my students opportunities to interview their family members and to create that family archive where that memory, those stories can be kept even within the family, not even just for public consumption, but as a way to document that history. And so I'll keep doing that work of encouraging my students to engage in oral history, not for just the assignment, but for themselves, for their family, especially as elders and grandparents get older.
I think that's the end of our questions. Kathleen Adams did mention that there is a Native Voices theater event that features Native playwrights and Native directors, and that will be opening on October 14th. So she hopes you'll come, but also for all the folks who are here, there's other great events happening on campus. But we really appreciate your talk tonight. It's been really informative, and I think we're all done for tonight, unless anyone has a last minute question. And yeah.
Okay. Well, I want to also thank you, Liz, and the Center of Southwest Studies, and Nick for your assistance and for the invitation to speak tonight. I really appreciate it. And I know our institution needs to hear this history many times over, and this is just one attempt at the history. There are many ways we can look at this particular moment, but again, I appreciate the staff of the Center of Southwest Studies and the invitation to participate. Thank you.
Thank you. Hope everybody has a lovely evening.
Mm-hmm. Good night. Bye.